Unfortunately, Jana Berankova, who has been one of the principal organizers of our meeting today, cannot be here today. She's in New York, but she's kindly sent along her talk, which I'll read. And I just say that Jana is completing her PhD at Columbia University in architecture and theory of architecture. She is a close and devoted reader of Badiou's works, whom we know already, for example, from the conference that we organized last year here in Prague on Badiou and mathematics, as well as other events that we've organized. And so we're very sorry not to have her here with us, but glad that she sent along her paper, which I will now read. Entitled, Series or Singularity, Badiou's and Sartre's Subject-in-Revolt. Jean-Paul Sartre's relatively understudied critique of dialectical reason is in many aspects a problematic book. Only one of the first 3 volumes was published in 1960, while the second one, unfinished, followed in the 1980s, and the third one is still missing today. The initial volume, however, subtitled Theory of Practical Ensembles, is a strange, almost 900-page long philosophical logomachy. Although the book embodied Sartre's clear turn toward Marxism, at its time, critique received only a mild reception. It seemed to reinvigorate the philosophy of history at the height of the structuralist Althusserian moment. Rather than conceiving Marxism as a science, Sartre saw Marxism as closely related to the freedom of emancipation of a collective subject. When in 1961 Sartre came to give a lecture at the École Normale Supérieure to many of the younger thinkers following Althusser, Balibar, Duroux, Miller, who were involved in the review Cahiers pour l'Analyse or attending Althusser's seminars, Sartre's philosophical approach didn't seem plausible anymore. To many, Sartre's Marxist turn seemed to come too late. One curious exception at the time was the young Alain Badiou, who's been repeatedly reminding us that Sartre's thought has been crucial for his early philosophical development. For instance, in a note at the end of Logics of Worlds, Badiou remarks that Sartre was his master, and even before attending the ENS, as a young candidate at the Cagne, he indulged in pastiche of being and nothingness, unquote. At a conference organized by the UCFML following Sartre's death in 1980, Badiou, worried that none of the speakers of the conference would address Sartre's critique of dialectical reason, presented a well-elaborated text devoted to the book. And in a short text republished in The Adventure of French Philosophy, Badiou states that the trajectory of his thinking, quote, may be perceived as the paradoxical combination of an energetic fidelity to the Sartrean message and the formal pulling to pieces of the dialectical schema that undergirds this message, unquote. So to what extent can Badiou's philosophy be read as a response to Sartre? In my paper, I'd like to briefly recapitulate Sartrean terminology in the first volume of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, and to propose possible comparisons with Badiou. For the sake of brevity, I'll presuppose some knowledge of Badiou's system. I'll also skip possible comparisons between the critique and being and nothingness, such as Perry Anderson, etc. Being and nothingness, the transposition of the terminology being nothingness into that of the critique, facticity becomes scarcity, etc. In the 1957 essay, Search for a Method, included in the first volume of the Critique, Sartre contested what he saw as the immobilism of Stalinist Marxism and its vulgar sociologism. According to him, such Marxism preferred what is static and immobile over the dialectical movement of an event, which is always necessarily plural and ambiguous. Such a conception often leads to economic determinism, in which the event, quote, would not be the French Revolution, but the appearance of the steam engine, unquote, and it would be turned into an edifying, homogeneous myth. Sartre, still somehow faithful to the radical conception of the subjective freedom of being and nothingness, convinced that a human being is a being defined by his or her project, rejected such determinism. The project is a constant production of the self through labor and praxis. In fact, in the critique, the term project often appears as synonymous with praxis, for praxis is a way by which a man identifies himself through his work, actions, or gestures in the surrounding world, and via this objectification, he acts retrospectively on himself. We might say that praxis is something like the constitutive alienation of man, an alienation that, unlike the passive alienation of seriality, is active. It's a way of actively shaping one's surroundings and the self. Sartre interprets praxis, the dialectical movement of producing one's life, of objectifying oneself in the world, and of relating to the other, as a genuine expression of human freedom. A human being is a being that tends to overcome its ontological condition. It strives to free itself from the chains of being. In the critique, praxis is intertwined with another term, that of totalization. According to Sartre, praxis, quote, born of need, is a totalization whose movement towards its own end practically makes the environment into a totality, unquote. As Jameson remarks in his preface to the English translation of the first volume of the Critique, Sartre might have coined the term in order to differ from Lukács's totality. Jameson reminds us that for Sartre, quote, a totality is precisely a static concept, a concept of being rather than of process, and one governed by analytic rather than dialectical reason, unquote. In other words, if totality stands for the predominance of the one, for the affirmation of the existence of the one, totalization is a process of unification, or what Badiou would call counting as one. Totalization is a dialectical process. It's an active, unifying movement, not the static being of the one. Totalization, quote, through multiplicities, continues that synthetic labor which makes each part an expression of the whole and which relates the whole to itself through the mediation of its parts, unquote. It is a, quote, developing activity which cannot cease without the multiplicity reverting to its original statute, unquote. The movement of totalization constitutes for Sartre the intelligibility of dialectical reason. In contrast, totality, as Sartre points out, quote, is a being which, while radically distinct from the sum of its parts, is present in its entirety in one form or another, in each of these parts, which relates to itself either through its relation to one or more of its parts, or through its relation to the relations between all or some of them, unquote. More importantly, Sartre claims that this totality is not real. It, quote, can only exist in the imaginary, unquote. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, totalization is the driving force of a dialectical procedure which transforms a collective into a fused group only in order to later dissolve it in the institution. So how does this movement work? The movement begins with any collective which Sartre understands as a material, inorganic object in the practico-inert field, insofar as a discrete multiplicity of active individuals is produced in it under the sign of the other, capital O, as a real unity within being, that is to say, as a passive synthesis, unquote. In the collective, individuals appear as beings in the world outside themselves, and are governed by the relationship of seriality. Sartre states that in the series, quote, everyone becomes himself as other than self, insofar as he is other than the others, and so, insofar as the others, capital O, are other than him, unquote. In the series, human beings remain together only as separate agents. The only link that exists between people is that of alterity. My relationship of reciprocity with others is false, for I do not consider myself to be a member of a whole. To give an example of a serial relationship, Sartre mentions a queue at a bus station, elections in so-called democratic countries, or the capitalist market. In all these examples, I see myself as the other of the others, and I do not conceive myself as a member of a group. During parliamentary elections, I vote for myself, but my vote has some validity only as long as it's counted as my isolated individual expression. The collection of votes into homogeneous sets, that is, sets representing parties or political factions, fractions, happens in the sphere of the other, out of my control. According to the electoral system, the expression of my political will is valid only as long as I express my personal opinion, and I'm separated from other individuals. Although I might try to be original, to vote differently from others, the electoral system sees me as nothing but a number. I'm merely one vote, the same as all others. By elucidating the notion of seriality, Sartre portrays the field that he calls inorganic or practico-inert. In this field, my actions can have unconscious results, for I don't see myself as a member of the group. I don't exercise control over totalization. For instance, during a financial crisis, I can sell certain assets to save my profits. But, however, by selling these assets along with millions of others who had the same idea and who act separately but together, I inadvertently contribute to the decrease of the value of the assets and thus also to my financial loss. According to Sartre, when I act in a serial manner, the apparent freedom of my act is false because I blindly follow the laws of the other, unable to see the totalization that my actions provoke. In the series, I'm exterior to myself. I'm subjugated to the others, and as such, I remain powerless and unable to change the state of affairs. In seriality, human being appears as a reified, alienated being. The being of a man is an inorganic passivity. It's nothing but an inertia of indifferent multiplicities. Seriality is the dominant mode of organization of a capitalist society. In the recently published Immanence of Truths, Badiou depicts seriality as one of the four modes of finitude. Following Sartre, he states that, quote, seriality unifies subjectively the totality of society, but in separation, unquote. In fact, seriality always leans on a third transcendent term, such as the laws of profit. This third term constitutes the very transcendental organization of the series. However, this transcendent term is completely beyond my reach. I merely follow its rules as a member of a mass. In order to overcome seriality and the practico-inert, human beings form groups, or what Sartre named fused groups, groups in fusion. In a fused group, I seize my totalization. I free myself from the chains of seriality by conceiving myself as a member of a collectivity. In a fused group, the difference between an individual and a collective act vanishes, and I experience a true relationship of reciprocity with others. I live my freedom as a member of the group, and I experience totalization as, quote, a practical dimension to be realized in and by its individuality. That's Sartre. And Sartre uses the term singularity, une dimension pratique à réaliser par sa singularité et dans sa singularité, evoking the opposition of singular and universal. Sartre points to the fact that by acting in a singular manner, I become universal. By being here in time, I become eternal. The fused group is a network of solidarity in which, by acting in my own singular and idiosyncratic manner, I'm equal to the others and contribute to realizing a common goal. In the fused group, each member is what Sartre calls the regulating third, i.e., the other with whom I establish a relationship of reciprocity. So, for instance, during the French Revolution, it doesn't matter who exclaimed for the first time, "À la Bastille," because this person, acting in its own singular manner, also acted in accord with the common interest of the group. In the Critique, Sartre also discusses the performative role of the pledge, le serment. The pledge enables members of the group to conceive the future as something rigid and inorganic by claiming that they will forever remain faithful to the group. He also describes the affective relationships within the group as that of fraternity terror, hyphenated. Since the group has to resist the serializing tendencies of its environment, the group produces the very category of betrayal, and there's always a risk that someone would betray the group. So comparing all of this with Badiou, we might say that in the notion of the fused group, Sartre portrayed something like a possibility of an event. For Badiou, the event is what is outside of being. It's the historicity that enters into a dialectical relationship with being qua being. For this reason, Badiou's matheme of the event in Being an Event, the book Being an Event, it also defines the event by the property of self-belonging, thus violating a crucial principle of the ZFC set theory, that which in Being an Event is equal to ontology. Similarly, Sartre's fused group is that which is outside of the inertia of being, or what's opposed to it, it's man's conscious appropriation of his own destiny. This conscious appropriation of one's destiny must be extorted from the inertia of being. Being knows no groups, only the inert multiplicity of collectives. In addition, for Badiou, events enable the possibility of subjectivation. Subjectivation consists in remaining faithful to the event by incorporating one of the four infinite truth procedures. For Badiou, we are born individuals, but through fidelity and generic procedures, we can become subjects. For Sartre, we are all only collectives governed by seriality, but through our fidelity to the pledge, we can become fused groups. For both Sartre and Badiou, the pledge and the related fixation of the future as something rigid or inorganic seems to play a crucial role. It's my fidelity to the event, my respecting of the pledge, that makes me incorporate one of Badiou's four generic truth procedures: love, art, science, politics. Similarly, for Sartre, the pledge of a fidelity enables the fused group to persevere in its existence. However, and now we get to the crucial point of divergence between the two thinkers, it would be hard to find something equivalent to Sartre's pessimism in Badiou's oeuvre. In Badiou's writings, there is not something that resembles the Sartrean fraternity terror. For it's the coercive character of the group that leads, according to Sartre, to its final falling back into the practico-inert. In the third step of his Dialectic, Sartre explains how the fused group establishes its inner organization, i.e. its own division of labor, its repartition of roles. In the organization, suddenly, the dialectic becomes reified. Members of the group start to represent different roles and experience their freedom as the freedom of the other. Progressively, the organization of the group is transformed into hierarchy. The static character of the pledge gives birth to, quote, the institution. In the institution, all relations are fixed and the dialectic becomes petrified. Seriality returns to the forefront. Each spontaneous initiative seems suspicious because the one who takes a personal initiative offers a glimpse of his freedom, unquote. The institution is a self-domestication of man by man. This is Sartre. When the fused group falls from grace and becomes institution, the figures of sovereignty emerge. The reified fused group might also give birth to state formations, and a state as such is, according to Sartre, an instrument serving the governing class in order to suppress class conflicts in favor of a national totalization. Such pessimism seems to be very different from Badiou's own conceptual apparatus, for the latter has spent much time advocating for new modes of organization and for the overcoming of finitude. In fact, what happens to the fused group in the third dialectical step, in Sartre's case, resembles very much what Badiou in The Immanence of Truths describes as a process of covering, recouvrement. In The Immanence of Truths, covering is described as a way of reducing the true actual infinity to the finite, that is, to potential infinity, the series, the constructible. This covering is a way of neutralizing, quote, an infinite potential of a situation that the dominant power wants to compel to stay under the law of the finite, unquote. This is Badiou in Immanence of Truths. In The Immanence of Truths, the evental potential is always infinite, staying within the sphere of the finite or the constructible, being described as reactionary, formulating new things in old terms. This might seem far away from Sartre's critique of dialectical reason. How do Badiou's considerations on the covering of the infinite by the finite remind us of Sartre's conceptual apparatus? In fact, we need to keep in mind the subtitle of the initial volume of Sartre's critique, Theory of Practical Ensembles, or ensemble, set. Badiou often states that Sartre's book might be read as an homage to Cantor, Georg Cantor. Of course, although Sartre referred in multiple passages of the book to cardinals and ordinals, he might have understood his philosophical project as being as conforming to some basic understanding of set theory. His references to set theory nonetheless remain superficial. Unlike Badiou, who's built his ontological edifice on set theory, Sartre's reference to mathematics does not go beyond a few notions and metaphors. Nonetheless, I'd like to bring attention here to at least two, at least apparent similarities between Cantor's notion of the set and Sartre's critique. First, replacing totality by totalization seems to be somehow shaped according to Cantor's series of infinite ordinals. Those of you who are familiar with set theory probably know that Cantor distinguishes cardinal numbers, the number of elements of a set, and ordinal numbers, describing the order and type of a set. In very simple words, the number 4 equals the fourth element, etc. Cantor's famous theorem stating that for any set A, the set of all subsets A, the power set, has a greater cardinality than A. This theorem gave birth to an entire hierarchy of infinite ordinals. Thus, if we conceive the smallest countable ordinal, which is a set of all natural numbers, we can pass on different levels of the infinite to create larger infinities by making, for instance, a power set of this smallest countable ordinal. This ordinal hierarchy of infinities has no closure, no final element. In other words, the one does not exist, but there are multiple procedures of unification, of counting as one, of creating larger and larger infinite sets. It may be that these basic properties of set theory inspired Sartre to think of groups and totalizations without totality, i.e., of totalizations that resemble what Lacan would call the unary trait, i.e., they reconcile the multiplicity and the purely operative role of the one as the result of a count. That said, unlike in Cantorian mathematics or Badiou's philosophical project, there seems to be no clear ascendant hierarchy of these subsequent totalizations in Sartre's doctrine. Second point, the first infinite is the infinite set of all natural numbers. This first infinite is the smallest infinite ordinal, and it is countable. Sartre's series seems to be equivalent to this first infinite. Omega corresponds to what Badiou describes in The Immanence of Truths as inaccessible infinity or infinity via transcendence, and to what Hegel might call simply bad infinity. This infinity has its structuring law outside itself. It's a potential infinity, an infinity defined simply by the fact that it is not finite, that there is always one more element that can be added to it. The formation of a group then might be seen as passing from the potential to the actual infinity, as passing on the level of uncountable infinities. However, seen from the perspective of set theory and Badiou's mathematized ontology, there's no reason why the uncountable infinity should fall back into the countable one. Set theory, and Badiou, proposes a hierarchy of greater and greater infinities, which can even approach the absolute class V, the place of all thinkable forms of the multiple. What justifies Sartre's return to the series to the countable, then? If Sartre was truly inspired by set theory, which is something that remains a question, what justifies his pessimism? Or is this pessimism simply a philosophical importation, perhaps of Hegelian nature, or a historical one, namely his rejection, Sartre's rejection of Stalinism? In fact, in Sartre's book, the set theory seems to be used as a projection of mathematical order upon historicity. And such a projection can, of course, only be imperfect. The critique, Sartre's critique, might very well be portrayed as a symmetrization or geometrization of history. This, of course, could seem controversial to Badiou, who's a thinker of contingency, the contingency of events for whom there is no reason of history, capital H. According to Badiou, there is no history, capital H, as such, only historicity. There would be, of course, much more to say about the convergences and divergences between these two thinkers and the role of the subject in Badiou and Sartre. But to conclude this short paper, let me just point to the fact that the optimism of the infinite versus the pessimism of the unsurpassable finite constitutes very likely the key to the divergence between these two thinkers. If Sartre seems closer to Milan Kundera's famous quip, the optimism is the opium of the people, then Badiou's role might very well be giving a little bit more opium to the people. Okay.